Great. Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Yoram Wijngaarde. I'm the founder of Dealroom. And Dealroom is also the co-initiator of European Startups together with Sifted, which is European Startups is a 2-year initiative to promote European startups. So can Europe be the most entrepreneurial continent? So in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to look at the journey so far, look at the present, and also at the future, the next 5 years. So starting with the journey so far, which has been about ditching an old image. So first, why do we need entrepreneurialism? Well, we're witnessing the continued unstoppable rise of tech. Tech is now considered the new oil or the new safe asset. And what you see in this chart is the Nasdaq, which has reached or topped $10 trillion, driven by companies like Apple, Microsoft, Amazon. But you see also a red line going down. So people call this the K-shaped recovery, which really is an acceleration of software eating the world. And this is being led by US and Chinese companies. So all these companies on the right, at least the American ones, are venture-backed. And actually, what's not always appreciated is that a huge part of the US economy is now venture-backed. So 1.2 trillion of VC has been invested in since 1995. And this has created over 10 trillion in value, but it has also created a lot of jobs. So more than 10% of all the jobs in the US are by VC-backed companies. And over 50% of the R&D spending in the US is done by companies that are backed by venture capital. So VC itself is a tiny industry, but it has a huge impact on the overall growth of the economy and also on the resilience. So quickly comparing this to Europe, most of you already know this, but of course, the amount of VC invested in Europe is far less. The amount of value created is far less, but the amount of R&D spending by VC-backed companies in Europe is negligible compared with with the overall R&D budgets, and it's less than 1% of the total jobs. But let's add a time component to this. So most of those big companies I mentioned before, like Amazon, Google, they've been created a long time ago, in a time when the European venture capital almost didn't exist or was really small. So these companies were basically unchallenged by European companies. So in 2005, and that's where you see the green line, venture capital was around 4% of global VC in Europe. And then it started to ramp up. And today it's about 15% of global venture capital happening in Europe. And since then, Europe has created 205 unicorns, almost all venture-backed, and has created also a lot of big exits. And if you look at what happened since 2005, you just look at the top 5 most valuable VC-backed companies, the difference actually is only 2.5 times, which sounds a lot more reasonable. Here you compare, for example, Adyen, Spotify, Delivery Hero with companies like Zoom and Uber. And if you look even more recently at the latest generation of entrepreneurs and startups, it's really impressive that 38% of all global seed stage capital is raised by European startups. So you see that on the left. And then on the right of this chart, you see that in later stages, the European market share of startups is much smaller. So just quickly summarizing this first 5 minutes, which is the first section of the presentation. Before 2005, companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, they were basically unchallenged in Europe. But then there was a second generation of European startups, such as Adyen. So you had Stripe in the US, but there's Adyen in Europe. You have Netflix in the US, but there's Spotify in Europe. You have Uber Eats, for example. Here we have Just Eat Takeaway, Delivery Hero. So that's already a very different story. And then if you look at what's happening today, as I said, 38% of all seed capital is invested in Europe, almost equal to what's happening in the US. So that's the journey so far. So let's look at the present: entrepreneurship, jobs, skills, and innovation. So as a result of these successes, the snowball effect now is in full force. So every European success story has a number of other successes that come out of it. The rise of Berlin can be led back to the Zamra brothers copying eBay in 1999 in Kreuzberg. And so there are stories like this throughout Europe, in France and in the UK. Skype led to Atomico, TransferWise, many set up their new VC firms, etc. So this snowball keeps getting bigger and bigger. And in a way, Silicon Valley is just a bigger snowball that's further down the hill. So what we need to do is make sure that we do not throw many obstacles in the path of the snowball. So for the compounding effect to work, basically employee ownership is key. That's the main takeaway here. And that's also the subject of not optional. Now looking further than just the founders and the entrepreneurs, the workforce, it seems nowadays that everyone works as a startup. And in fact, startups have created 2 million jobs already in Europe. And with startup, I mean companies, VC-backed companies that have been founded since 2000. And they're growing at, the number of jobs is growing at about 10% per year. So it's adding 200,000 jobs roughly every year. And with this growth rate, basically startups are a major contributor to new jobs. In fact, 10% is far faster than any individual sector. And even in absolute terms, startups are starting to become a major contributor to job growth in cities. And what we have seen that even in the pandemic, startups have continued hiring, and many startups have even accelerated hiring. But there is more. So that so far is very positive. There's more that we need to learn from the US, for example, and it's not just about Silicon Valley. In the US, more money is just going into tech. There's faster adoption of technology, and corporates spend much more money on IT. So in other words, the implication of this is Europe needs to get corporates to innovate more and to adopt faster. On the R&D side, things are also, there's a lot to improve. So the two biggest R&D spenders are Amazon and Google. The third biggest R&D spender in the world is Volkswagen. So the point here is not that the US spends more on R&D, because the difference is not even that big. But the point is that corporate R&D spending in the US is dominated by big tech companies that are really investing in the future. Whereas in Europe, R&D is more dominated by industrial companies. For example, Volkswagen spends most of its R&D on combustion engines. And we know also about a brain drain taking place. So AI professors are leaving universities to work for big tech, and those big tech companies are mostly based in the US. So with that, let's talk about the future. So what do we need most in the next 5 years? What should we be doing to help startups? At the seed stage, Europe is doing very okay, actually. We saw that with this 38% percentage that I mentioned earlier, which is very acceptable. And also less capital is needed at the seed stage in general. There are seed funds out there. Perhaps there can be some more seed funds on a national level, but that's something that can be taken care of also on a national level. Also, the graduation rate from a seed stage to a Series A stage company is really low. So the risk is super high. And perhaps it's not the best place for government to be directly involved in picking winners. At least it should be very careful. At the Series A stage, so the second block, there are also plenty of European funds, in fact. But from Series C onwards, the field starts to become a lot thinner. And Series C basically means from 40 million round size. And these are mostly done still by... these are still mostly done by US firms. So European VCs have been raising record amounts of new funds, including Index Ventures, Atomico, Lakestar, and especially what you can see is that has been especially happening at seed and Series A stages. But European startups need at least 3 times more capital than that already today. And so all that additional capital is coming from additional investor groups from like US and Asian VCs, growth, private equity, sovereign wealth funds, corporates, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, that is a positive, but much bigger tech companies will be built in the coming years, needing more and more funding. What you see here is that companies like Spotify have basically created big companies in areas that are actually very small markets compared with other potential markets. Even food delivery is only a fraction of the economy, and tech is now starting to penetrate more fundamental parts of the economy like healthcare, banking, education, and housing, which need much more capital. So what should the role of the government be? Where should the government provide support? Well, Europe already has institutions and programs in place to provide support. You can see almost every European country has a fund of funds system, and also on the European level, there is the EIF, which has been quite successful. There are innovation programs or grants. Most countries have equity co-investing schemes, debt co-investing, tax credits, etc. So there is already a lot of infrastructure in place. So what should happen with that? So it is often said that Europe is strong in deep tech. And what I showed earlier is that we're actually entering now an age of AI in the coming years. So does that mean that that is where the government should focus? So yeah, deep tech is really cool, and companies like UiPath, GraphCore, DeepMind are really cool. But you know, what's also really cool is TikTok. And TikTok alone is worth more than all of European deep tech combined, depending how you define deep tech. So it's been said many times, I think, that Europe is good at innovation, but bad at commercialization. And this starts with the idea of what a startup is, and what tech is, and what innovation is. So let me explain what I mean. So what do companies that dominate their market have in common? So look here, these are the major categories like search, social, online advertising, all dominated by a handful of usually American companies. So if you look at how those companies started, they made something people didn't realize they needed, but ended up loving to use. So they built up a huge demand for their product. And companies like TikTok prove that it's possible to break in. So these are not monopolies in a classical sense. Consumers can choose between Google and Bing, for example, but they choose Google because they think it's the best product. So basically, these are all products that people love to use. So what should we really be building? So maybe this is thought-provoking to some and obvious to others, but we should not just be building deep tech. It's more important to build things that people love to use. And this is sometimes missing from the initiatives. And in Europe, I think we like to do things in style, and that's fine. So it will be great if we can also solve some of our biggest challenges like climate change, but we should never forget about the commercial component, and maybe we should even put that first. Because what you saw in the R&D data is that bigger companies get bigger R&D budgets in the end. And so they will be able to solve complex issues with deep tech, but the commerce comes first. So to finalize and conclude my presentation, I would recommend, yes, to attracting and incentivizing talent, including stimulating employee ownership. And Europe probably also needs more late stage capital, for which fund of funds are probably the best vehicle. What we should be wary about is about government picking winners or creating deep tech without a strategy or commerce behind it, and penalizing exits or employee ownership. So to finish off, creating an entrepreneurial ecosystem maybe sometimes feels like a chicken and egg problem. So which comes first? Well, the answer is probably neither, because both the chicken and the egg are a commodity soon anyway. So what comes first is aggregating demand for the egg through a superior user experience. And for that, you need brilliant entrepreneurs. Thank you.